Okay, we are now going to move to our next session for the day, one that I'm really very pleased that we are able to present to you. In 2023, Australians will be asked to constitutionally recognise a voice to Parliament for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And in this session today, we will explore the background to the voice, why it's important for business and investment, and hopefully clear up a few misunderstandings. Professor Marsha Langton, our speaker today, will be well known to many of you and is uniquely qualified to provide us with insight into these issues. Professor Langton's work as an anthropologist, geographer and public intellectual spans almost 5 decades. Among many achievements and contributions, she co-chaired the senior advisory group that made recommendations to government on enshrining the national voice in the Constitution. And importantly, that report also makes recommendations for a cohesive and integrated system comprised of local and regional voices alongside the national voice. The report stands at 269 pages, which means that it contains a lot of detail and a significant amount of thought, which was the subject of substantial consultation. So I'm going to invite Marsha to join us on the stage and also to invite Jamie Lowe to join us as well. Jamie's the Chief Executive Officer of the National Native Title Council and a representative on the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. So Marsha's going to make some opening remarks, and then Jamie, Marsha and I will have a conversation, and there will be an opportunity again for your questions. So please welcome Marsha and Jamie to the stage.
Thanks, Louise.
Welcome. Please. Hi, Jamie.
Thank you. It's nice to be here with you. I acknowledge the Gadigal and Dharawal traditional owners of this place and their ancestors and elders past and present. And thanks to those of you who in the industry assisted us as we addressed the destruction of Yukon Gorge and the responsibility of investors to be responsible towards Indigenous cultural heritage and our homelands and landscapes. There are some people here who were so important in assisting us to get a recompense for those traditional owners and also improving the cultural heritage laws in Western Australia. And I'll leave it to Jamie if he wants to talk about that. But there's a way to go, so we look forward to your continuing support as we strive to make industry more responsible in its behaviour, especially in relation to the resource extraction industries. But that incident, the Yukon Gorge destruction, is just one of many. And so many assaults on Aboriginal life and not just ways of life, but also standards of living. I think some facts about Yukon Gorge are quite relevant here in this discussion about the voice. As Rio Tinto well knew, or some people in Rio Tinto well knew, but ignored, archaeologists had worked with the traditional owners and found cultural heritage material, including human hair, from which DNA was extracted, in the caves, and all of that evidence showed that the present-day PKK peoples are the direct descendants of people who lived there 45,000 years ago. So that is a place of great antiquity, and it was destroyed without consultation, without regard to the legally binding Indigenous land use agreement with the traditional owners. And so both the spirit of the arrangement with the traditional owners and the actual terms of the Indigenous Land Use Agreement were cynically and expediently breached. So when I say that this is just one of many incidents, we could, between us, just us two, refer you to hundreds more, and even some as egregious as the destruction of that place. Now, we know from other archaeological evidence that our ancestors were here, certainly 50,000 years ago. There are so many places now that where archaeologists have found the evidence. And now we see that archaeologists have found evidence for 65,000 years and possibly longer. And so 1/5 of human history is represented by Aboriginal people on this continent. And yet, in 1901, when white colonial men finally settled on the Constitution of Australia, uniting the 6 colonies as a federation under the Commonwealth, they deliberately excluded Aboriginal people from the Constitution. And the first 2 pieces of legislation to pass the Australian Parliament were racist. One was related to the South Sea Islanders, who were essentially slaves. They were indentured labour. And the other was the White Australia policy. And so until the referendum in 1967, when questions were put to Australian voters to allow Aboriginal people to be counted in the census and to allow the Commonwealth to make laws for Aboriginal people, the Australian Constitution was explicitly racist and deliberately and in plain sight excluded Aboriginal people and by implication Torres Strait Islander people, who were not even mentioned in all of that history. Now, many people believe that that referendum corrected the Constitution and gave Aboriginal people equal rights. That's not true. The questions were amended by the Attorney General's office and the Solicitor General's office before they went to the referendum. And so while, yes, that referendum allowed us to be counted in the census and the Commonwealth to make laws, the Constitution remained explicitly racist. So I ask you to have a look at Section 25. Sure, it's a hangover from the pre-67 referendum, but it's there. And people say, oh, it will never be used. Well, I don't believe that because we did not think that John Howard would use the external affairs power to send the Defence Forces into the Northern Territory and impose the Northern Territory Emergency Intervention, which was, again, explicitly and deliberately racist. So also, Section 51(26) is a racist provision in our Constitution. And the High Court has affirmed in the Continuary case that the Commonwealth Government can use that power to the detriment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So I am astonished at the people who are advocating for a no vote because they are deliberately lying. They're saying that what we are proposing is racist, and yet what they are defending, everybody who's ever studied constitutional law or Australian history will know, is racist. What we are proposing in a yes vote for the referendum is in fact a remedy for that historical racism and the explicit racism in our Constitution. Now, our campaign bodies, our leaders don't want me to tell you this because they want me to say nice things like, the yes vote will unite us all and, you know, achieve a reconciled Australia. Well, it will certainly make our lives much easier. That is true. But it won't achieve the long-term goals that we aspire to without a lot of hard work. And a yes vote for the voice is one plank that is absolutely necessary to achieve equity for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I'll just read out the question because I think it's my duty to tell you in case you missed the news. So we'll all be voting probably in October after the grand finals on this. A proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve this proposed alteration? And if Australians do vote for yes for that question, there'll be a new section 129 in the Constitution, and it will say, in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the First Peoples of Australia, there shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. The voice may make representations to the Parliament and Executive Government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, including its composition, functions, powers and procedures. So in other words, you're voting, yes, there shall be a voice, and then Parliament will work out the details. Now, as Louise said, I was the co-chair of the process to design the voice, and Jamie was, in fact, you were on our local and regional advisory group, weren't you?
The National
Voice,
yep.
Sorry, the National Voice co-design group. So we had 3 groups of people. There were 52, all of us, of us all together. Myself and Tom Calmer were the co-chairs. And apart from 2 people who became ill, everybody else participated and not only helped to design the voice, consulted across the country with thousands of people, but also have lobbied hard ever since for what we envisage would be a very practical way for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to be involved in advising the Commonwealth Government through the National Voice and state and territory governments and local government through the regional voices to remedy the terrible inequity. So why should you know about this? And why would I ask you to vote yes? Well, there were some in the industry, as I said, who supported us as we tried to tame the resource extraction industry as it prepared to go off a cliff. So now we ask you to lend your considerable weight to achieve equity for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Now, perhaps there's nothing explicit that you can do, but here's the situation. Our population is about 800,000 people now. They say we're approaching 4% of the entire population. But for those of you who've ever worked in remote Australia, you'll know that far from being 3% of the population, across northern Australia, the Indigenous population is anything from 10% to 90% of the population, which would explain why at least half a dozen Liberal Party members are not declaring their hand on the issue, because they represent seats with large Aboriginal populations, such as Warranench in Cape York. So, yes, Rio Tinto has, removed certain people from its senior executive appointed an Aboriginal person to its board, first time ever in history, and really changed the way that they've been going about business lately. We need this to happen across the country because over 60% of our population are under the age of 25. You've seen all the hysteria whipped up in Alice Springs about youth crime and the fate of children. But that is one place, and only one place across the continent, where children are at risk because of poverty, because of exclusion from the economy, because of overcrowding in houses, because they don't have enough to eat. The poverty in the Western Desert is the worst in the country. It's disguised by the wealth of the mining towns on the coast, but once you get past the coast, out into the desert, the communities and I said this to Jenny Macklin when she was the minister, they're like what you would see in parts of the Sudan, except they don't have the guns. And I've been warning ministers for years that unless we do something about that poverty and include people in the economy, we will have something like the Intifada. So instead of reporting on these children as criminals, I want to see some empathy for those children. I want to see people saying, can't we find a way to assist their parents and their community to keep them in school? Beating down on them and their parents and criminalising them and othering them in this way is not an answer to the problem. For decades, people like Jamie, Patrick Dodson, and many others have worked to address these issues. The Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, the Aboriginal Reconciliation Council, which actually first recommended constitutional recognition of a voice 30 years ago. The inquiry into the forced removal of Aboriginal children, the Don Dale Royal Commission, many more royal commissions and inquiries and coronial inquiries, and most of the recommendations have not been implemented, were ignored. And indeed, every time we've had anything like a representative voice, most of them have not been legislated, only two, they've been removed. So at each election, the National Aboriginal Committee was abolished. That was more than 30 years ago. Then it was replaced eventually by the National Aboriginal Consultative Committee. Then at election when, you know, one of the politicians was in a bit of electoral strife, punched down on the Aborigines again, abolished the NACC. Then the Aboriginal Development Commission was established, then it was abolished. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission was established, then it was abolished. People say that it was a disaster. That's simply not true. That was the electoral message from the Liberal Party under John Howard to criminalise us again. No charges were ever laid against any of the ATSIC commissioners. There were no convictions. The regional bodies did a very good job, and where ATSIC got to at that point was to do an audit of the housing deficit in Aboriginal Australia. Well, with the recommendation that was coming to the government to build more houses, of course the government had to get rid of it, and they did. More bodies were established and removed, including Tony Abbott's Aboriginal Advisory Committee chaired by Warren Mundine, which as far as I can recollect did precisely nothing. Yes, we have an Indigenous Land Corporation and Indigenous Business Australia, but they arose out of our native title negotiations with Paul Keating when he was Prime Minister. And they're very important, and I'll tell you why, and this is relevant to you. If you go to the Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation website and have a look at the maps of Indigenous Australia, you will see that over 70% of Australia has some kind of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander interest. Not a secure land title, but an interest in which industry is required to give Aboriginal people or Torres Strait Islander people a seat at the table to obtain access, such as Rio Tinto had to do in relation to its Indigenous Land Use Agreement. There are hundreds of Indigenous Land Use Agreements. They're not an obstacle to industry. They're not an obstacle to our economy. They're actually, you know, much like the kind of regulation that your industry is facing, to keep it honest. So, you know, if you want Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to survive into the future, this kind of regulation is important to the future of about 4,000 communities, about 600,000 young people, and the other 200,000 of us are going to, you know, be gone soon, and you'll face your industries that you invest in will face our young population, who are the most disadvantaged Australians. Only a third of our population, probably less, has closed the gap. For myself, yes, I've sort of closed the gap by becoming educated. But for so many people, securing that one, you know, foothold is not enough. People are pushed back down so quickly. So 2/3 of our population, most of them young, face a very uncertain future unless we have constitutional enshrinement of the voice to give Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people a say in the policies that affect us, to bring common sense to the policy, to end the political football game of, you know, kicking us off a cliff every time a politician's in trouble, and bringing common sense to our policies that relate to people on the ground. Because Peter Dutton and Jacinta Price going into Alice Springs and squawking is not going to solve those problems. That community has to be involved in solving those problems, and exploiting the child abuse issue is not an answer to this problem. In fact, the child abuse rates in Queensland are far higher, and Peter should go home and solve those problems in Queensland and let the community in Alice Springs deal with the lives of children and their parents in a compassionate and meaningful way that results in a better outcome. So I talk about these issues because these are the issues I'm involved in, but you could talk to any Aboriginal person and find a range of other problems where our issues have been pushed off a cliff time and time again. Life is so much worse for Aboriginal people than when I was young. You won't notice it here in the big city. You might notice it in parts of Western Sydney. But once you get beyond the Great Dividing Ranges and further out, you'll see terrible poverty and exclusion. We should turn that around. We have the capacity to turn this around. Australia is, on one measure, one of the richest countries in the world, with individuals having the highest income in the world because of our superannuation. And yet, this problem can't be fixed. So let's end the misery fest of the Closing the Gap days in March, when the Parliament receives the Closing the Gap report, and put some meaningful policy in place through a constitutionally enshrined voice. That's my message to you. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Marsha. Thank you. I don't know where to start because there's just so many things to unpack, and also feel a slight sense of shame about the litany of woes that I think that one's been used. Here's a clean one.
Thank you.
So let's just start with some of the, I suppose, political football issues. There's been some discussion that the voice will be Canberra focused, or a Canberra voice, and I completely understand that that is, a political positioning. But I did want to get to the rebuttal of that from the perspective that I think that the work from the Senior Advisory Group really does contemplate quite a strong role for local and regional voices, and I wonder if we could get some explanation about that. I don't know, Jamie, if that's something you can weigh in on to give Marcia's voice a rest for a moment.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I'll give Marcia a rest, and great rotation up there, Marcia. I think the message really cut through, but just also a little bit of history of how we got to a constitutionally enshrined voice as the proposed question that we have now. Many of you would have remembered the Recognise campaign about a decade or so ago now. There was a comprehensive consultation process with community and also broader than the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander community to the general public as well. And there's a few questions proposed there around what recognition within the Constitution would look like. And not only our people, but the broader community said it had need to be meaningful. So that's how we landed on the voice being actually constitutionally enshrined rather than just a preamble or something to that effect. So that was a strong message. It wasn't something that was just dreamt up. It was a message that came from not only our people, but also the broader community as well. And of course, there's been a number of iterations since Recognise that was a thing, and now we are here today. And Marcia and I were part of the 52 people, where Marcia was chair with Professor Tom, Karma, and I was part of the national, and then we had a regional and local group as well. So that we were tasked with kind of, building the architecture of what the local and regional bodies would, and how they would feed up to a national group as well. So, and the overwhelming message from those experts that were in the room, and also with our extensive consultation with community, that this needs to be built from the bottom up. And that came out in the report. Of course, what that would look like in Canberra, of course that was tossed around as well, because it needs to culminate and give representations to Canberra, yeah. But the overwhelming message, to speak to Marcia's point about the issues in Alice Springs and elsewhere within our, particularly those regional and remote locations within Australia, is that the voices of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people on the local level can only solve their local issues, yeah? It can't be something that's done with Canberra politicians or even with individuals from the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander community just representing, their own voice and their own views within Canberra. The fundamental view was the bottom-up approach. So, and that came out strongly within the report as well. I know it's quite comprehensive. There's over 250 pages there, but there is a summary there which breaks it all down as well. So I would encourage those of you who have the time and the avid readers, get in there. But if you just want to read the executive summary, that gives you enough detail as well. Of course, this government hasn't been able to adopt that report. That was actually something that was the architecture that was put in place by the previous government. So they actually are supportive of a voice. Now, then you get to the question of the Constitution, yeah, which is where the debate lies at the moment, which I think the current opposition's a little bit disingenuous in the way they're representing the, I guess the shortfalls of, a voice and how they would be structured today.
I double-checked with the Prime Minister's office recently about the position on this. So it's important to understand that our voice co-design process that Jamie just told you about was the result of a recommendation from a joint select parliamentary committee chaired by Julian Lisa and Senator Patrick Dodson. And that joint select committee made 4 recommendations. One was that there should be a process to investigate how to achieve the constitutional reform, such as constitutional recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The second one was that there should be a process to design the voice. That's what we were involved in. And by the way, the fourth one was to allocate a place to return all of the Aboriginal human remains that had been shipped overseas to museums and collecting institutions. And so that's, you know, underway as well. So as a result of the first recommendation, the Referendum Council was set up, and that led to the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Our terms of reference explicitly excluded any consideration of the Constitution, and we were confined to designing the architecture of the voice. And so with Prime Minister Albanese's announcement that there would be a referendum, it brings together those two parts of the Lisa Dodson report and all the work that followed. And I have asked the Prime Minister's office, which, you know, and the Prime Minister has mentioned the so-called Kalma-Langton report many times, as has Linda Burney. And there was a suggestion in one of the newspapers that, you know, everybody had gone silent about it. So I rang the Prime Minister's office, and no, that's not the case. And our Kalma-Langton report, the report of 52 people to the previous government, will be the basis for parliamentary consideration of the design of the voice. So all you have to do is Google Indigenous Voice Co-Design. You'll find, you know, I think the second Google result down will be the final report. Have a look at the final report. Pages 16 to 19 is where there's an executive summary with a diagrammatic explanation. We recommended, in relation to the regional and local voices, up to 35 regions, but to be determined in the future by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, because state and territory boundaries don't always reflect, you know, cultural regions. So you have, for instance, the Nganadara, Pitjantjatjara, Yankunytjatjara Women's Council, and they cover 3 states, and they deliver services to all the Anangu across the Northern Territory, South Australia and Western Australia. So, you know, special consideration has to be given to them. And you have a couple of other examples of cross-border cultural regions as well, like in Albury-Wodonga. So we said that each of the state and territory regional voices that are developed would appoint to the national voice, they'd get together and appoint people to the national voice, 1 or 2 from each state, depending on population. But in addition to that, extra places for people from remote areas because of the dire inequity in the remote areas. Extra places, I think 1 extra place for or 2 for the Aboriginal, for the Torres Strait Islander people who live on the mainland, because more of them live on the mainland now than in the islands, and that's been the case for over 50 years. 2 permanent advisory bodies, 1 for disabled people, because 1 in 4 of our people are disabled, 1 for youth, because 60% of our population is under the age of 25, and also a couple of empty chairs so that people could, you know, appoint somebody who's an expert on a national issue. But the regional bodies are confined to dealing with regional issues and can only send advice to the national voice on national issues. And of course, everybody knows what they are. The incarceration rates, the youth detention rates, the removal of children, the dire need for housing, certain health problems. And I could go on. Economic development, jobs. So there are some issues that are going to come up in every regional body, and they will necessarily constitute national issues. We do suggest that these regional bodies or local bodies should develop relationships with their state and territory governments, with their local governments, and that in time each of the states would legislate these bodies as, you know, or some arrangement for these local and regional bodies to give advice. And before we even got to the starting block, South Australia did just that. South Australia has legislated an Indigenous voice. It's up and running, and the sky didn't fall in. Apartheid didn't magically appear, except in Corey Bernardi's imagination on Sky News.
We have seen states really kind of get on the front foot with this. You've seen Victoria, which established their First Peoples Treaty Assembly, which I'm a part of as well, and they've also supported the voice, and which will naturally evolve into the voice of Victoria, their state representative body. So you're seeing the leadership of states and their governments and their First Nations community, and also the broader community actually supporting, exactly what we're talking about. So, and as Marcia states, the sky hasn't fallen in, and actually supporting all the things that Marcia spoke about, and business and industry at the same time.
We've got a lot of questions coming in on the Q&A. I'm going to combine one of them with one of my own questions, which was, I've noticed recently there has been a number of large businesses announce their public support for the voice. So I think Woolworths, Bendigo Bank are ones that come to mind just over recent times. So is that helpful? And the question I've got on the Q&A is, should investors publicly declare support for the Yes campaign? Is that helpful, or does it hinder the campaign in the suburbs and places, the more regional areas of Queensland and WA, for example? Do you have a view on whether it's a useful thing? And I think my second question is, why should business and investors care about the voice? What tangible difference will it make, do you think, for the way that we are able to, the frameworks and relationships that business will then be able to more readily establish?
I think it's overwhelmingly helpful that businesses and AFL clubs and universities support the referendum question. My university does, and there was no debate. Both the council and the executive of the university put out a statement respectful of academic freedom. Everybody has a choice, but the council and the executive unanimously support the voice. And that's very encouraging for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We're about 1% of the staff at the University of Melbourne and about 1% of the student population. So we've got a long way to go to reach equity at the University of Melbourne. And the council and the executive understand that very well, and they want to achieve equity. It's just hard work. You've got to, keep trying everything to see if it works. And so, people who develop policy, who implement policy, they know how hard it is. And you can't achieve any of this without involving people, the people affected. And people want a better Australia. They want to put to bed this historical set of injustices that comes up every year on Australia Day, every year in NAIDOC Week, in the Reconciliation Week, and whenever Lydia organises a demonstration outside Flinders Street Station, So we just need to, it's a waste of time. We just need to work together, put an end to the conflict, and get on with business. Recognising Indigenous people in the Constitution is a very simple and well over time way of, achieving a statement of equity that should have been there in the first place and wasn't. So I think it's terrifically important.
That's very clear. Jane?
Yeah, and if you look globally, Australia is fundamentally playing catch-up, with their relationship with their First Nations people, particularly in regard to past injustices, etc. And if you think that industry weren't to support it, it would be, all of the industry bodies have got reconciliation action plans, all of them, and they report against that to Reconciliation Australia on an annual basis. You'd think if they weren't to support it, this is a significant step, and probably one of the most significant within recent history, at least, towards reconciling a future with First Nations people here in Australia. So you think that if industry wasn't supporting it, that would be a step backwards for them in regard to their reconciling their business. And I think that I agree with Marcia to get the investment sector supporting that, which hasn't necessarily had a voice within this space in the past, is critical. And it's another step. Marcia spoke strongly about heritage and its protection and the role that industry played, but the investment sector played within that and holding industry to account. This is another step towards that as well.
And I guess I'm interested in your perspective, Jamie, because I know that you were involved with it, watching closely the work that was done with Rio Tinto post-Yukon. My sense is that, that having frameworks and relationships that ensure that all stakeholders are considered and treated respectfully is very important, but also would be supported by the concept of the voice to Parliament. Like, introducing that as a national framework seems to me to be an important step in going that next level in terms of how companies engage with their Indigenous stakeholders. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, and the key to this is the constitutional enshrinement of it, yeah? Part of the public debate is that why don't we just legislate? Why can't we just move on and legislate and, we don't even need to ask the community of that? And I think Professor Langton spoke really well about, we know as First Nations people acutely aware of, at the whim of government, that our voice can actually be dismantled at any given day of the week, yeah? You get the right political climate that's actually against us, and that would actually push out not only the relationship with First Nations people, with industry and investment, that'd push it back decades. So I would ask the question and pose the question, what if there was a no vote? I reckon that would put us back, decades as far as our kind of reconciliation movement within Australia.
That was going to be one of my questions, but we're almost out of time, and I think that this might be a good question to finish on, which is, what are some practical ways, this is from the audience, what are some practical ways that people in this room can support the Yes campaign?
There's a Yes23 website, yes23.com.au, and also, is it Yes Together? Together Yes? Together Yes, .com.au. So they're the two, very active campaign groups that provide individuals the opportunity to join, get resources, some training on how to, convince family and friends and work colleagues. It provides a lot of information. There are 3 other campaign groups, but I won't confuse you because you'll find out about them by just going to Yes23. And what I've been doing is joining up with people in the Together Yes and Yes23 campaign and attending what we call kitchen table meetings. They might be in a lunchroom or actually in somebody's home, and having intimate conversations about why this is important, because people believe so much nonsense about Aboriginal people, and that, they've inherited sort of bodies of mythology, and it's quite hard work to give people the facts and give them a useful way forward. So that's working really well. And, if this is unlike the marriage equality campaign. Now, most of us obviously thought, well, yeah, of course they should be able to get married. Why are we even being asked this question? Because every one of us has, a gay cousin or sister or brother or, colleague, uncle, or kids for that matter. So, but the idea that gay people couldn't get married I think it was a shock to a lot of us to learn that that was the case. This is different because so few Australians know Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And that is why we have to intensify the kitchen table approach. Now, you might see, Latrell on TV on Saturdays or whenever there's an NRL game, or any of the AFL greats. But it's not like knowing a person in the way that we, you know, all know somebody gay who was, you know, back then entitled to equality in marriage. Here, we're faced with, you know, a much different problem also in that if Australians, as Jamie said, if Australians vote no in this referendum, essentially they're handing on to their children and to future children this horrible problem that could be so easily fixed. Why hand it on to the children? We don't want to hand it on to our children. I'm sure you don't want to hand it on to your children. Let's fix this. We have this one opportunity to fix it. Let's fix it.
Okay, thank you. That's, I think that's a fantastic note to end on. So we've got some pretty clear calls to action there. It's helpful if we are vocal on this, and we need to educate ourselves so that we can have those kitchen table conversations. Thank you very much, Jamie and Marsha. Particularly want to thank you not just for being here, but for the big load that you're carrying in promoting the importance of the voice throughout Australia. I think it's an incredible piece of work that you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you.